Marcus Reynolds stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, staring at the Manhattan skyline as the sun set behind the skyscrapers. His reflection showed a man who, at 35, had everything money could buy, and nothing that truly mattered. The Forbes magazine on his desk featured his face on the cover, celebrating his $4.2 billion net worth. But he couldn't bring himself to even open it. "Mr. Reynolds, the board meeting is about to start," his assistant Sarah announced through the intercom. He adjusted his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit and sighed. Another meeting where potential matches would be paraded before him by well-meaning board members who thought the company needed a proper public image. Their daughters, nieces, and family friends, all carefully selected from the upper echelons of society. The memory of his last relationship still stung. Victoria, the hedge fund manager's daughter, who had carefully orchestrated their entire relationship for the eventual merger she and her father had planned. 6 months of what he thought was love, all detailed in a spreadsheet he discovered accidentally on her laptop. That night, alone in his vast penthouse, Marcus watched a reality TV show, some dating competition where regular people found love. He laughed at first, then stopped. The contestants' genuine reactions, their real emotions, their authentic connections. When was the last time someone looked at him, not his bank account? An idea began to form. Crazy? Yes. Risky? Absolutely. But for the first time in months, he felt alive. The next morning, he called a private meeting with his most trusted advisor, James Chen. "I'm going undercover," Marcus announced, pacing his office. "The Miss American Dream pageant is looking for additional staff and judges' assistants. I've already created a fake identity, Mark Rivers, a former event coordinator from Chicago." James nearly choked on his coffee. "Have you lost your mind? The press would have a field day if they found out." "That's exactly why it's perfect," Marcus argued, his eyes lighting up with determination. No one would expect Marcus Reynolds, the Wolf of Wall Street 2.0 as they call me, to be carrying water bottles and arranging schedules at a beauty pageant. And more importantly, no one there will know my bank account before they know my heart. He had already thought it through. 3 months away from the office, with James handling the day-to-day operations, a carefully crafted background story, a complete makeover, trading his designer suits for off-the-rack clothes, his Swiss watch for a simple Timex, his slicked-back hair for a more casual style, even growing a beard to further disguise his famous face. And what happens when you actually find someone? How do you explain lying about who you are? James challenged. Marcus walked back to the window, watching the city buzz below. "If I find someone who loves Mark Rivers, the nobody from Chicago, then I'll know it's real. And if she can't understand why I had to do this..." He turned back to James, a mix of vulnerability and determination in his eyes. "Then, she's not the one I'm looking for." The next day, while the business world buzzed about Marcus Reynolds taking a sabbatical for personal growth and reflection, Mark Rivers submitted his application to the Miss American Dream organization. The game was about to begin, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was playing for something that actually mattered. Isabella Santos rushed through the bustling streets of New York, her waitress uniform hidden under a worn denim jacket. Her dark curls, hastily tied back, bounced with each hurried step. 3 minutes until her shift at the diner ended, and exactly 20 minutes to make it to the Miss American Dream preliminary meeting. "Bella." "Phone call." Her manager called out just as she was hanging up her apron. Her heart stopped. The hospital only called during work hours when something was wrong. "Mom?" Her voice trembled. "I'm fine, honey," Maria Santos reassured her with a weak voice. "Just wanted to remind you to eat something before the meeting. You can't survive on coffee and determination alone." Isabella smiled, tears pricking at her eyes. Even from a hospital bed, her mother was still trying to take care of her. The medical bills were mounting. Experimental treatments weren't covered by insurance, but Isabella refused to let her mother know how many extra shifts she was taking. At 26, with a journalism degree gathering dust and 3 jobs keeping her afloat, entering a beauty pageant wasn't exactly her life plan. But the $100,000 prize money could cover her mother's treatment, and more importantly, give Isabella access to the elite circles she needed to investigate her real story. The dark side of beauty pageants. The preliminary meeting was held in a luxurious hotel ballroom. Isabella felt out of place among the designer clothes and perfectly manicured contestants until she spotted him, a man in a slightly rumpled button-down shirt, carrying a stack of folders, looking as overwhelmed as she felt. First time in this circus too? She helped him catch a falling folder. That obvious, huh? Mark Rivers, according to his staff badge, gave her a warm smile that reached his eyes. Something about him seemed different. Not like the polished pageant officials or the artificial smiles surrounding them. I'm Isabella. Contestant number 347, apparently. She handed him back the folder. Mark, just the guy who makes sure everyone has enough water and the right paperwork. He paused, studying her face. You don't seem like the typical pageant type. She laughed, a genuine sound that turned heads. Is it the coffee stains on my shoes, or the fact that I'm the only one here without a crown-carrying coach? Before Mark could respond, a commotion erupted near the registration desk. A contestant was in tears, her registration apparently lost, despite having proof of submission. Isabella didn't hesitate. She walked over, pressed record on her phone discreetly, and started asking questions. Years of investigative journalism instincts kicked in. Within minutes, she had not only helped the girl prove her registration was intentionally misplaced, but had gathered her first piece of evidence about the corruption she suspected ran through these competitions. What she didn't notice was Mark watching her intently, his own mask slipping for a moment as genuine admiration crossed his face. This wasn't the kind of woman who would be impressed by bank accounts or business empires. This was someone who fought for others, who saw beyond the surface, exactly what he had been looking for. But as Isabella turned back to smile at him, a familiar face entered the ballroom. Victoria Chen, his ex-fiancée, now apparently a judge for the competition. Their eyes met across the room, and Marcus felt his carefully constructed plan begin to unravel. Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched in recognition, a slow, calculated smile spreading across her face. She reached for her phone, and Marcus knew the clock was now ticking on his charade. Isabella noticed the sudden tension. Everything okay, Mark? He forced a smile, already calculating how to handle Victoria without revealing his true identity. Just remembered I have a lot of paperwork to file. He glanced at Isabella's registration form. You're in Group C for the preliminary interviews tomorrow. Don't be late, some judges can be unforgiving. As he hurried away, Isabella watched him curiously. Her investigative instincts were tingling. There was more to Mark Rivers than met the eye, and if there was one thing Isabella Santos couldn't resist, it was a good mystery. Little did she know, she was about to uncover the biggest story of her career, and possibly lose her heart in the process. Victoria Chen's Louboutin heels clicked purposefully across the marble floor of the Four Seasons Hotel bar. Marcus, still dressed as Mark Rivers in his intentionally modest attire, sat waiting, his hands wrapped around an untouched whiskey. I must say, this is beneath even your usual dramatic flair, Marcus, she purred, sliding into the seat across from him. Or should I call you Mark? The shabby clothes are quite convincing. What do you want, Victoria? His voice was low, controlled, but his knuckles were white around the glass. She laughed, the sound like crystal breaking. Oh, darling, you know exactly what I want. The Chen Industries merger you killed when you found that silly little spreadsheet? My father's company is still struggling to recover. She pulled out her phone, displaying a photo of him helping Isabella earlier. Imagine the headlines. Billionaire Marcus Reynolds infiltrates beauty pageant. The scandal would be delicious. Before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through their tension. Mark, I thought you had paperwork to file. Isabella stood there, still in her waitress uniform, holding a serving tray. Of all the bars in New York, she had to work at this one. Victoria's perfectly painted lips curved into a predatory smile. Oh, Mark hasn't told you? He and I go way back. Marcus watched Isabella's expression shift, not with jealousy, but with that sharp journalistic insight he'd noticed earlier. She was putting pieces together, and his heart sank. Actually, Isabella set down her tray, I'm more interested in why a pageant judge is having private meetings with staff. Isn't that against competition rules? Her phone was already recording in her apron pocket. Victoria's smile faltered. Marcus saw his chance. Miss Chen was just informing me about some special dietary requirements for the contestants, he said smoothly. Years of boardroom negotiations paying off. Which reminds me, I need those forms filed tonight. If you'll excuse me, ladies. He left quickly, but not before catching Isabella's expression. She wasn't buying it for a second. Later that night, Isabella sat cross-legged on her tiny apartment floor, surrounded by research papers. Her laptop showed multiple tabs: Marcus Reynolds' Forbes profile, Victoria Chen's social media, and old news articles about the failed Chen Industries merger. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother's nurse. Another complications. Another bill. She glanced at her pageant entry form, at the promise of prize money that could solve everything. But her journalist's notebook sat next to it, filled with growing evidence of corruption that could bring the whole competition down. A knock at her door made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw Marcus, still in his disguise, looking troubled. "How did you find my address?" she asked through the door. "Staff has access to contestant information," he replied, then winced at how creepy that sounded. "I need to explain about Victoria." "You mean about how you're Marcus Reynolds, the billionaire?" She opened the door, but kept the chain on. "Or about how you're infiltrating the pageant?" "Because I have to say, as undercover stories go, mine just got a lot more interesting." His face fell. "Isabella, it's not what you think." "Really? Because I think a billionaire is playing dress-up while real people's lives are at stake." "My mother is dying, Mark, or whatever your name is. I entered this contest for her. What's your excuse?" He met her eyes through the gap in the door. "Let me explain. Please. Not as Marcus Reynolds or Mark Rivers. Just as me." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. Finally, she closed the door. Marcus's heart sank until he heard the chain sliding free. She opened the door fully, revealing her cluttered apartment with its wall of investigation notes. "Start talking. And it better be good, because I have 2 stories now, and I'm trying to decide which one to pursue." But before Marcus could begin, both their phones buzzed simultaneously. It was a message from the pageant organization. Due to anonymous allegations of misconduct, all contestants and staff must attend an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Attendance mandatory. Multiple disqualifications pending. They looked at each other, realizing the same thing. Victoria wasn't just coming after Marcus anymore. She was threatening to bring down the entire pageant, and with it, both their chances of achieving their goals. In the silence that followed, Marcus noticed a medical bill on Isabella's table, the amount making his heart sink. She quickly covered it, but not before he saw the red urgent stamp. "We have a bigger problem than my identity," he said quietly. Isabella crossed her arms. "I'm listening." "Victoria's not just a judge. She's part of something bigger. And I think you and I both need to figure out what that is before she destroys everything. Your story, your chance at the prize money, and any hope I have of proving I'm more than my bank account." She studied him for a long moment, her investigative instincts warring with her personal feelings. Finally, she grabbed her notebook. "Start from the beginning," she said. "And this time, no lies." As Marcus began his story, neither of them noticed Victoria Chen in a car across the street, watching through binoculars, a cruel smile playing on her lips as she dialed a number. "Daddy, everything's in place. By this time tomorrow, Marcus Reynolds won't know what hit him, and neither will this pathetic little pageant." The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel buzzed with tension at 7 a.m. Contestants whispered among themselves, makeup already perfect, despite the early hour. Isabella, in a simple black blazer over her waitress uniform from her morning shift, stood out like a dandelion in a rose garden. Marcus, still maintaining his Mark Rivers persona, watched from near the stage as Victoria Chen took her place at the judges' panel, looking triumphant. Next to her sat her father, Richard Chen, newly announced as the pageant's primary sponsor. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard Chen's voice boomed through the microphone. "We've received disturbing information about certain contestants using the pageant as a cover for investigative journalism." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Isabella. "Such behavior violates our competition rules and..." "Actually, it doesn't." Isabella stood up, her voice clear and steady. "I've read the rulebook cover to cover. There's no rule against contestants having other professions or motivations. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus felt his heart race. She was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, probably both. Victoria leaned into her microphone. Perhaps we should discuss the real issue, certain staff members who aren't who they claim to be. Her eyes locked with Marcus's. Specifically, Isabella interrupted again, pulling out her phone. We should discuss these audio recordings of Judge Chen offering to rig scores for certain contestants in exchange for their family's business connections. The room went dead silent, Victoria's face drained of color. Young lady, Richard Chen started, but Isabella wasn't finished. Or maybe we should talk about the shell companies set up to funnel pageant funds into private accounts? I have those documents too. She started walking toward the stage. And let's not forget the testimonies from previous contestants about blackmail, coercion, and fraud. Marcus watched in amazement as she climbed the stairs to the stage, each step deliberate. This wasn't just about her story anymore. She was fighting for every contestant who'd ever been manipulated or exploited. You have no proof, Victoria hissed, but her hand was shaking as she reached for her water glass. Isabella smiled. Actually, I do. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence has already been sent to 3 different news outlets. If anything happens to me or any other contestant, it all goes public immediately. Marcus couldn't help himself. He started laughing. The sound broke the tension in the room, and suddenly other contestants were standing up, sharing their own stories of corruption and manipulation. But Richard Chen wasn't finished. He gestured, and security guards moved toward Isabella. This is all very entertaining, but you're just a waitress playing journalist. Who's going to believe you over us? I will. Marcus stepped forward, finally dropping his fake accent. Or should I say, Marcus Reynolds will. The gasps were audible as he walked to the stage, pulling off his fake beard. And my testimony about the Chen family's attempted corporate espionage, combined with Miss Santos's evidence, should be quite compelling. Victoria stood up so quickly her chair toppled backward. You wouldn't dare. Your reputation? My reputation? Marcus laughed again. I came here looking for something real in a world of fake smiles and hidden agendas. And you know what? I found it. He looked at Isabella, who was staring at him with a mixture of surprise and something else. Just not where I expected to. Richard Chen's face had turned purple. This is outrageous. I'll ruin you both. No, you won't. A new voice rang out from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see FBI agents entering, led by none other than Isabella's mother, no longer in a hospital gown, but wearing an FBI jacket. Agent Maria Santos, FBI Special Investigations, she announced, walking down the aisle. We've been building this case for months. My daughter's undercover work was just the final piece we needed. Isabella's jaw dropped. Mom, but... The hospital. Maria smiled. We're better to gather intelligence than a hospital where rich people let their guards down. Though those medical bills we planted in your apartment last night were a bit over the top, don't you think? Marcus turned to Isabella, who looked as shocked as he felt. You didn't know? She shook her head, laughing despite herself. I guess we both had our secrets. As the FBI began making arrests, Marcus and Isabella found themselves standing alone at the edge of the chaos. So, he said, no dying mother? No, she smiled. And no lonely billionaire looking for love? Oh, that part was real. He took her hand. Though I have to say, finding someone who could out-scheme me wasn't part of the plan. Speaking of schemes, she squeezed his hand but didn't let go. I still have a story to write. Billionaire and undercover reporter expose beauty pageant corruption has a nice ring to it. Maybe we could discuss it over coffee? He glanced at her waitress uniform. At a different diner, preferably. She laughed, then turned serious. You know this means everything changes. Your perfect billionaire image needed to change anyway. He pulled her closer. Besides, I think it's time Marcus Reynolds became known for something more than his bank account. As they left the ballroom, Victoria's angry shouts echoing behind them as she was led away in handcuffs, Isabella looked up at Marcus. Just promise me one thing? Anything. No more fake beards. They don't suit you at all. Their laughter echoed through the hotel lobby, real and unrestrained, as they stepped out into the New York morning, both finally free to be exactly who they were. The New York Times newsroom was buzzing. Isabella sat at her new desk, quite an upgrade from her waitressing days, staring at her laptop screen where dozens of news alerts kept popping up. Beauty and the Billionaire, pageant scandal rocks elite society. Chen Industries stock plummets following corruption exposure. Marcus Reynolds, the billionaire who went undercover for love. She smiled at the last one. If they only knew the half of it. Your story's trending worldwide, her editor said, dropping another coffee on her desk. The follow-up piece needs to be on my desk by tomorrow. No pressure. Isabella nodded, but her mind wandered to the text she'd received earlier from Marcus. Dinner tonight? Wearing no disguises this time. Promise. The past week had been a whirlwind. The FBI had uncovered a massive network of corruption extending far beyond the pageant, shell companies, blackmail schemes, and corporate espionage that made Victoria's revenge plot look like amateur hour. Several prominent business figures were now facing federal charges, and the Chen family's empire was crumbling. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. The Bureau is impressed, Maria said without preamble. They're offering you a position in investigative operations. Isabella laughed. You know, most mothers just want their daughters to marry rich. Well, technically, you could do both, Maria teased. Speaking of which, have you seen today's Wall Street Journal? Isabella quickly pulled up the article. Reynolds Enterprises announces new investigative journalism fund. Marcus Reynolds pledges $50 million to support independent investigative reporting. He didn't tell me about this. Isabella murmured. Of course not, her mother replied. He submitted the paperwork this morning, something about wanting it to be a surprise. After hanging up, Isabella opened her document to write the follow-up piece, but another news alert caught her eye. Victoria Chen speaks. They were in it together from the start. The article claimed that Isabella and Marcus had planned everything, that their meeting wasn't chance but a calculated plot, that their romance was as fake as his beard had been. Her phone buzzed again. Marcus, have you seen it? Yes, she typed back. Victoria's desperate. Meet me at Central Park, our bench. Need to ask you something important. Their bench, she smiled at the phrase. It was where they'd met secretly during the investigation, planning their next moves, sharing discoveries, and gradually realizing that what had started as a convenient alliance had grown into something neither of them had expected. When she arrived, Marcus was already there, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. No designer suit today, just jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than her old apartment's monthly rent. So, she sat beside him. A journalism fund? He grinned. I figured if I'm dating an investigative reporter, I should support the cause. Dating? Is that what we're calling this? His expression turned serious. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk about. He turned to face her fully. Victoria's article, about us planning it together from the start. Isabella's heart sank. You know that's not true. I know, but it made me think, what if we had met normally? What if I'd just been Marcus and you'd just been Isabella from the beginning? She raised an eyebrow. You mean if you hadn't been playing poor and I hadn't been playing pageant contestant? Exactly. He took her hand. Would you have given me a chance? Isabella pretended to think about it. Well, I probably wouldn't have helped you carry those folders. I dropped those on purpose, you know. She stared at him. You did not. Did too. Saw you coming and thought, wow, needed an excuse to talk to you. He grinned. Best staged accident of my life. So you were playing me from the start? She punched his arm playfully. Says the undercover reporter who was recording everything I said. They both laughed, then fell into a comfortable silence, watching the park's usual chaos unfold around them. You never answered my question, he said finally, about giving me a chance. Isabella turned to him. You know what I think? I think we did meet normally. Two people hiding behind facades, trying to do the right thing for different reasons, who found out they worked better together than apart. She squeezed his hand. The masks just gave us time to see each other clearly. Marcus pulled her closer. I have another question then. If it's about the journalism fund, I'm not letting you name it after me. Actually, he reached into his pocket. It's about forever. Isabella's breath caught as she saw the small box in his hand. Marcus, before you answer, he said quickly, you should know that your mother already approved. A Apparently, she did a very thorough background check on me during the investigation. Of course she did. Isabella laughed through sudden tears. So? He opened the box, revealing a ring that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated. Want to write our next story together? Isabella looked at the man she'd first known as Mark Rivers, the fake assistant with a real heart, and smiled. On one condition. Name it. Our wedding announcement can't use the phrase, Beauty and the Billionaire. I'm still a journalist, and I have standards. Marcus laughed, slipping the ring onto her finger. Deal. Though I have to warn you, the tabloids are going to have a field day. Let them, Isabella said, pulling him into a kiss. We know the real story. Above them, a newspaper blown by the wind fluttered past, its headline visible for a moment. Pageant scandal update, truth, lies, and love. But for once, neither the reporter nor the billionaire was paying attention to the headlines. They were too busy writing their own. In a stunning development following the Miss American Dream pageant scandal, the TV droned in Isabella's new office at the Reynolds Center for Investigative Journalism. 3 months had passed since the proposal in Central Park, and the story was still making waves. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Turn on Channel 7. Victoria's sentencing is about to start. Isabella switched channels just in time to see Victoria Chen, now without her designer clothes and perfect makeup, being led into the courthouse. The news ticker below read, Beauty pageant scandal. Victoria Chen faces up to 20 years for fraud, extortion, and corporate espionage. Miss Chen, any comment on the rumors that you're writing a tell-all book? A reporter shouted. Victoria's trademark smirk flickered across her face. The truth always comes out, doesn't it? Just ask Marcus and Isabella Reynolds. Isabella touched her wedding ring unconsciously. The private ceremony last month had somehow stayed out of the press, a minor miracle orchestrated by her mother's FBI connections and Marcus's surprisingly stealthy security team. Her office door opened and Marcus walked in, loosening his tie. Ready for the press conference? She looked at the speech on her desk. Their joint announcement of the Reynolds Center's first major initiative, a nationwide program to support young investigative journalists. Almost, she said, standing to straighten his tie, though I still think naming the scholarship program after me is too much. The Isabella Santos Fellowship for Truth in Journalism has a nice ring to it, he argued, pulling her close. Besides, you're the one who proved that one determined reporter can change everything. We proved it together, she corrected, though I still can't believe you actually dropped those folders on purpose. He laughed. Best corporate espionage I ever committed. A knock at the door interrupted them. Maria Santos, now officially retired from the FBI and heading the center's security division, entered. They're ready for you both downstairs, she said, then smiled. And Isabella, your final draft about the Chen case just won the Pulitzer Committee's vote. They'll announce it next week. Isabella's jaw dropped. Mom, you're not supposed to know that yet. Maria winked. Old habits die hard. Now come on, you've got a room full of young journalists waiting to learn how two people in disguise managed to expose the biggest corruption scandal of the year. As they rode the elevator down to the conference room, Isabella looked at her reflection in the mirrored walls. No more waitress uniform, no more undercover disguises. Just herself, standing next to the man who had proven that sometimes the richest things in life had nothing to do with money. Nervous? Marcus asked, squeezing her hand. About telling our story again? Never. She smiled, though I'm curious about one thing. What's that? If I hadn't been investigate the pageant, if you hadn't been looking for something real, do you think we would have still found each other? Marcus turned to face her. You know what I think? I think some stories are meant to be told, some truths are meant to be uncovered, and some people, he kissed her softly, are meant to find each other, disguises and all. The elevator doors opened to reveal a lobby full of aspiring journalists, all eager to hear how a fake pageant assistant and an undercover reporter had changed the face of investigative journalism and found love in the process. Ready to inspire the next generation? Marcus whispered. Isabella straightened her shoulders, the same determination in her eyes that had first caught his attention that day in the ballroom. Ready to change the world again? Hand in hand, they stepped forward, ready to tell their story one more time. Not just about corruption exposed or justice served, but about how the search for truth had led them to find something even more valuable, a love that was real, no matter what masks they had worn to find it. Behind them, the elevator doors closed on their reflection. No longer the billionaire in disguise and the undercover reporter, but simply Marcus and Isabella Reynolds, two people who had proven that sometimes the best stories aren't just reported. They're lived. The TV in the lobby switched to breaking news. Chen Industries assets seized, funds to be redistributed to victims of pageant fraud. Below that, a smaller headline scrolled, Reynolds Center announces nationwide initiative to support investigative journalism. Isabella smiled. Some headlines told stories of scandal and corruption, but this one told a story of hope, of change, and of what could happen when two people dared to look beneath the surface and find something real. Marcus squeezed her hand one more time as they approached the podium. Ready to write the next chapter? With you? Isabella squeezed back. Always. The cameras flashed as they stepped into the spotlight, ready to share their truth with the world. Not as the beauty and the billionaire, but as two people who had discovered that the greatest disguise of all was thinking they could pretend not to fall in love. 5 years later. And that, kids, is how one beauty pageant changed investigative journalism forever. Isabella concluded her speech at Columbia University's School of Journalism. The students erupted in applause, but one hand shot up immediately. Mrs. Reynolds, weren't you scared, going against the Chen family empire? Isabella smiled, adjusting her press badge. She'd never given up active reporting, despite running the Reynolds Center. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones we need to tell most. At the back of the lecture hall, Marcus leaned against the wall, their 4-year-old daughter Verity perched on his shoulders. She wore a toy press badge matching her mother's, a gift from her grandmother Maria, who now ran the FBI's partnership program with investigative journalists. Mommy found the bad guys? Verity whispered loudly, making several students laugh. Actually, sweetie. Marcus adjusted her small blazer. Mommy found the truth. The bad guys just happened to be in the way. After the lecture, the family walked through campus, Verity between them, holding both their hands and occasionally jumping. The Reynolds Center's 5th anniversary gala is tonight, Isabella reminded them, though she knew Marcus never forgot anything. Victoria's being paroled next month. I know, Marcus squeezed her hand. Mom already has surveillance set up. Isabella laughed. Having an FBI agent for a mother-in-law had its perks. The magazine called again, she added. They still want to do the Beauty and the Billionaire 5 years later cover story. And I told them we're more interested in covering the 100 investigations our fellows broke this year. She grinned, though I did say they could interview Verity. Their daughter perked up. Can I wear my press badge? Always wear your press badge, sweetheart, Marcus said solemnly. It's how people know you're telling the truth. As they approached their old bench in Central Park, now bearing a small plaque commemorating the Reynolds Center's founding, Isabella pulled out her phone. Look what Mom sent. It was a photo from 5 years ago. Marcus in his fake beard, Isabella in her waitress uniform, both unaware they were being surveilled by the FBI. Hard to believe that's how it started, Marcus mused. No, Isabella corrected him, watching Verity pretend to interview a squirrel with her toy microphone. That's how something much bigger started. The truth, they'd learned, was like love. It grew beyond what you could plan or imagine, creating ripples that touched lives you'd never even meet. Above them, a billboard caught the setting sun. Reynolds Center launches Global Truth Initiative. Some stories, it turned out, never really ended. They just kept getting better. End.